Order! Order! You are an incorrigible delinquent at times. Behave yourself, man!
Emily Thornberry is Jeremy Corbyn's parliamentary neighbour in Islington, and she's become a key supporter of the Labour leader. He's appointed her shadow foreign secretary at a time when the party's policy on Europe and the world has never been more important. Emily Thornberry, welcome.
Thank you.
There seems to be some doubt in people's minds, even now, about Labour's real attitude to Brexit. Can I ask you some very simple questions? First of all, do you think that we should be a member of the single market after Brexit?
I think we need to have the widest possible access to the single market after we leave the European Union.
And do you accept, given that everything that the European leaders have been saying, and people here as well, that that means we could not have control over immigration?
I think that's subject to negotiation. And I think that we need to be reasonable about it, and we need to think quite carefully about what the trade-off is. Our priority is the economy, and we need to make sure that whatever decisions are made, we don't make ourselves poorer and we don't take away anybody's jobs.
Because, I mean, you say that there should be a negotiation, but for a lot of people, there seems to be a very little gap between being inside the single market and accepting free movement of people and being outside. Your colleague Diane Abbott has said you cannot have access to the single market or be part of the single market without freedom of movement. I think a lot of people would agree with that. And she goes on, it's time people started acknowledging that. Those of us who are arguing for the least harmful Brexit have to be clear to people that there is no deal to be done on freedom of movement and to imperil our economic interests, as you were saying, as a country, because of anti-immigrant feeling could scarcely be responsible. Do you agree with that?
Yeah, I agree with a lot of that, yeah, absolutely.
So, in the end, if we're not part of the single market, if we are going to be part of the single market, if we're going to have access to the single market, we are going to have to concede control over freedom of movement. We can't have both things.
I think that David Cameron missed a fantastic opportunity to look at reforming one of the pillars of the European Union before the general election, before we had the referendum. He went off and was going to fix the European Union. And yet the Europeans saw him coming. They saw that he wasn't acting on behalf of the whole of Britain, and he got nothing. And that, it seemed to me, to be a golden opportunity that was wasted. I think that we have common cause with other people across Europe in terms of exactly what freedom of movement of workers means. And I think there's more work that could be done if it was done in an atmosphere of good faith. But quite frankly, the way in which Boris Johnson is behaving at the moment, he's undermining any good faith there could possibly be with our European friends and neighbours.
I'm still slightly confused. The kind of access that you want to the single market, and lots of businesses agree with you, comes at the price of conceding free movement of people. Do you accept that? Because that's what Diana is saying, and she's right.
Yeah, I think that what we need to do is to look at what freedom of movement of workers means and how it is defined and how it is applied. And I think there is quite a lot of room for manoeuvre in there. I think that David Cameron tried to do it, but was simply not in the right place.
Examples of where we could get to then.
So, for example, we could look at what is the definition of a worker, at what stage you need to be looking for work, how long you can be in the country without being able to find work.
People would still be allowed to come in here.
Well, yes, people would still be able to come in here, and then there would be the question of in what circumstances could they find work, in what areas of the country might they be able to find work. There are a whole range of options that are available and all subject to negotiation. But we are so far away from that. The government has absolutely no plan at all at the moment.
I'm trying to work out where Labour would like to be, as it were, post-Brexit. So you're not going to stop it happening. You're going to allow Article 50 to be triggered. Indeed, you're going to vote for Article 50 to be triggered. And then after that, you're trying to get maximum access to European markets. And that might mean very large numbers of European workers still being able to come and work here in exchange for access to those markets.
Our first priority is the economy. Well, the first priority of any government should be the safety and security of its people. The second priority of any government should be the economy, because if the economy does badly, it is people who are only just managing who will suffer. And we have to bear that in mind when making decisions about the future of our country for the sake of our kids and for our grandchildren. That is our abiding principle. Now, how that works out is subject to negotiation. And at this stage, it seems to us that the government ought to be confident enough to be able to come to us and say, these are the main principles on which we are going to be negotiating.
You sound as vague as they do at the moment. You say, we want our cake and eat it. We want access to the single market and we want some kind of control over immigration. What about the customs union, for instance?
No, it is about time we stopped talking about believing in cake, having our cake and eating our cake. We have to look at the options, and we have to know that it is a trade-off, and that we need to be able to have a proper debate within the British public as to what the options are. We need to have a long-term relationship with Europe, and we need to be honest about what that means. Now, do I think that too many people at the moment come into this country? I think that, yes, I think they do. And I think they do because I think that we have a skills shortage. We are not training enough people in this country. You know, why is it that we are so dependent?
Less immigration under a Labour government, is your saying?
Well, it's because we need to address the skills gap. And if we address the skills gap, we won't have the same need for more people coming in. Do we have employers who take advantage of sucking people in from other countries and undercutting wages and undercutting conditions? Yes, we do. And we need to be able to control that as well. And it seems to me that if we were to address those problems properly, if employers were finally actually training some of our youngsters so they did have the skills.
So I get it. Listen, can I ask you about one other thing that's come up this week, which is both John Major and Tony Blair have said that if things are as bad economically as they may be, as some of the official reports the OBR are suggesting, then there should be a second referendum so people can have a second chance. Do you agree with that or not?
I think that we need to take this in stages, and at the moment we cannot even have a debate as to how it is that we're going to leave the European Union, because the government claim they're keeping their cards to their chest, but we know they don't have any cards and they don't even know what game they're playing. And it is about time they came out of their darkened room and they told us in what way we're going to leave the European Union and what our continuing relationship is likely to be, so that we can debate it. And so Theresa May can go to Europe and say, I'm representing the whole of Britain. They need to act on behalf of 100% and not on behalf of extreme 5% of the 52%.
Sure. But if you don't like what they say when they finally come and tell us, if you don't like the vision they have, what then happens? Can you stop them in Parliament? Do you try to stop them in Parliament in some way? Do you think there should be a second referendum as a break? What then happens so that you can get your way and they don't get their way?
I think this needs to be taken step by step, but they will not take the first step, which is they have had 5 months now, 5 months. You know, David Cameron specifically told the civil service not to look at a plan B. They now have had 5 months to work out what their plan is going to be, and they come with nothing. That is the starting point. Let us start with what it is the government wants to negotiate, and then we can have a reaction from the public and a proper debate, and then we can decide how we want to proceed. But until they actually lay down their basic negotiating position, we cannot even begin this debate.
Your leader and your friend, Jeremy Corbyn, said of Fidel Castro that he was a great fighter for social justice and a huge historical figure. And a lot of people thought he'd failed to address the dark side of the Castro regime, all those killings, the abuse of gay people, the torture and so forth. What is your view?
I think that Castro was a hugely divisive figure, and I think that it's quite difficult to get beyond the human rights abuses. But my own experience, I went to Cuba in the early 1990s when there was great economic difficulties in that country. And I found a country that was egalitarian, with a fantastic health service. I had my baby with me. I had to go off and see the doctor, and we were really struck by it.
But it came at a heck of a price.
It came at a price, but it was in my view, it was a brave island that stood against a regime that for 50 years would not trade with it and would not let other countries trade with it too. And not only did they stand firm and strong, they also exported their values across South America and into Africa, producing doctors and nurses
like you're giving
and
him
teachers.
A bit of an easy pass for the the camps, the torture. I mean, this came at a huge price. If it was Pinochet, people on the left would say he was a monster, he was terrible, he should be got rid of. But because he wore a red star on his fatigues and so forth, you seem to be quite gentle on him.
Yeah, and if you look at some of the right-wing press that were supporting Pinochet, they're the ones who come out and accuse Castro of all the things that they do. Let me just put this to you. How can it be that a little island like Cuba can have not only sufficient doctors and nurses to be able to look after the people of Cuba, but they can also export them across South America and into Africa to give more doctors to fight the Ebola crisis than the Americans? And that little tiny country could do that, and we can't.
But how can you kind of set that alongside, for instance, machine gunning people in boats, including children, when they're trying to leave the country? I mean, how do you make this kind of? It's very hard to make a kind of equal sign or an equivalent sign between the dark side and the bright side of Cuba. There is a bright side, but there's a very, very dark side
I
as well.
acknowledge that. I acknowledge that. But all I'm saying is that from my experience was visiting a country that was, at the time, they didn't have enough petrol to be able to drive cars. They were going around on bicycles on the May Day parade. But nevertheless, there were not people starving, and they still had an excellent health and an education service. I'm not saying any more than that, but it was an enormous achievement for a little Caribbean island.
Okay. Final thought, very, very quickly. You heard Stephen Dorrell there talking about the crisis in social care. Do you agree with him and with Paul Mason that we're going to see a crisis that's going to run out through the rest of this year? And do you think the Chancellor should be back in the House of Commons putting more money into social care?
Absolutely, absolutely. I was in Warwickshire yesterday and people are desperately worried about what is going to happen. You know, what will happen with their elderly relatives? Will they be got up at breakfast time or will they be got up at lunchtime? What will happen with people going into hospital in crisis and not being able to come out again? You know, for every pound we spend on social care, we save 2, 3, 4, 5 in the National Health Service.
We're going to talk later, I hope, a little bit longer. But for now, thank you very much indeed, Emily Thornberry. Now, the leading Tory strategist behind the successful campaign to persuade Britain to leave the EU was the former Lord Chancellor, Michael Gove. Since being fired from the government by Theresa May in July, he's been writing about the American elections and he's helped found Change Britain, a group dedicated to ensuring that the government delivers on the Brexit vote. Welcome, Mr. Gove.
Hi, good morning, Andrew.
Good morning. Can I ask you, first of all, about the slew of official forecasts we've had this week? Pretty terrifying. Now, we're not economists and all of that, but 200,000 job losses they're talking about, an extra £60 billion hole in the public finances and a miserable decade of almost no growth in real wages for most people. It's possible that they're right, isn't it?
Well, for me, it felt like déjà vu all over again. I remember during the referendum campaign that we had a litany of warnings. The sky was going to be dark. There'd be a plague of flogs on the street if we voted to leave the European Union. And the reality, as you pointed out at the top of the show, is that actually over the course of the last 2 weeks and months...
We've had the Land Rover announcement, we've had lots of good news and so on.
Exactly. And I think that, therefore, the Chancellor and the Prime Minister are right, obviously, to respect the independence of the OBR, but right also to take it, as the Chancellor's aides were saying, with a pinch of salt. Because there's a challenge here, not so much for the government as for many of those who were so heavily invested in what became known as Project Fear. Because the economists and the opinion pollsters...
almost want to be proved right, as you're saying.
What's one of my concerns? And also, economists overall, I think, have to recognise that their profession is in crisis. That the economics profession failed to predict the 2008 financial crash. That economists in the past argued almost to a man and woman that we should enter the single currency. They were proven wrong. And as a profession, they were proven wrong about the impact of Britain voting to leave the European Union.
So we're watching them very carefully, but neither of us are economists, and here's the Institute of Fiscal Studies, who are, pretty respected, and the OBR people themselves, who have lots of expertise. Now, they may be right and they may be wrong, but when you look at the range of possibilities ahead, as a non-expert, as I'm a non-expert, surely you have to accept the possibility that they may be right.
Yes, you have to accept that possibility. Now, I'm as you can tell, radically sceptical about some of the claims that are made, but I respect the fact that there is an integrity to the individuals making these predictions. They look at the information they have, they draw the conclusions which they consider appropriate. In the circumstances, that's why I think that Philip Hammond, as Chancellor, handled the autumn statement about right. He didn't embark on a lurch in any particular direction. He, I think, wisely allowed some additional measures to ensure that there would be infrastructure spending in order to sustain economic growth in the future, so that there was a fiscal boost alongside the monetary measures that have been taken in the past. But to return to the whole area of prediction, one of the things you mentioned right at the beginning of the programme as well is that I was critical of experts. In the now notorious comment that I made, I was actually cut off in midstream, as politicians often are, and the point I made is not that all experts are wrong. That's manifestly nonsense. Expert engineers...
cars driven...
Exactly. Expert engineers, expert doctors, expert physicists. But there is a subclass of experts, particularly economists, pollsters, social scientists, who really do have to reflect on some of the mistakes that they've made. And the same as a politician, I reflect on some of the mistakes I've made.
OK, and reflecting on mistakes, if, as I say, a big if, they were right, and we do face a dreadful decade, would you then apologise to people for embarking us on this path?
Well, I've always been ready to apologise for mistakes that I've made, not necessarily immediately, but certainly after a period of reflection. But as I say, I'm radically sceptical about these claims because we've been told beforehand that doom is going to follow. It hasn't. And why look in these crystal balls when you can read the book? And the book tells us, the reports tell us that, as you mentioned, that there's been significant additional investment in the British economy, that we have record low unemployment, that inflation is still at a decent and tamed level, and that economic growth is higher, and the recession, which was predicted that we would have if we voted to leave
by now,
has gone like a puff of smoke.
Okay, now since we have you here as one of the architects of the whole Leave campaign and we're trying to work out what's going on, can I just check a few things with you? Am I right to say that if we were in the customs union, we would not be able to do the free trade deals around the world that will be essential to our future outside the EU, and that therefore, in your view, we could not be in a customs union?
Yes, I can't see how you can. I mean, I think that when people voted to leave the European Union, they voted to take back control of our money, our laws, trade deals, and our borders. And that means that the single market, which is basically a bureaucratic web, we need to be out of, and the customs union, insofar as it prevents us from forging trade deals with other countries, we should be out of that too.
And control means control. So I'm trying to work out what the government could do, because obviously business wants maximum access to these markets, 500 million people and so forth. If we had some kind of deal whereby we did sector-by-sector deals to allow groups of EU workers to carry on coming into this country, you know, the construction industry says we need X number of plumbers, or the NHS said we need these numbers of gynecological nurses, or whatever it might be. They get a ticket from the government, those people can come in, and in return for that, we get tariff-free access to key markets. That would be a deal that you could live with.
It's up to the government to decide. My own view, I could live with it. My own view and preference, strong preference, is for a fair migration policy which does not discriminate between EU citizens and others. I don't see, just because you happen to be Bulgarian, why you should have any more right to come here than someone from Bangladesh. It should be a case of skills. And as you say, if it is the case that there are particular skills that people have that can aid our NHS, they should come here. But my own belief, my own conviction, is that you should have a colourblind, non-discriminatory immigration policy. But also, I think there's a tendency to overcomplicate this. We can, I think, fairly quickly say to the other European nations, look, all your citizens who are here, they're safe. We hope that UK citizens will be safe in the EU, but we'll guarantee them. We're a civilised country. And I think we can also say...
We should be doing that right now.
Yes. And we can also say at the same time, look, if you really want to, you can start a trade war with us. But we don't want that. We want to have continued tariff-free access. You sell more to us than we do to you. So we're actually doing you net a favour. But we want to be good neighbours.
Okay. Very clear. Let me ask you about a few other things that have come up recently. First of all, John Major, your former leader, has suggested that if we don't like the deal that we are getting, there should be a second referendum. Democratically, is there any reason why there shouldn't be?
Well, I think that people would be rightly angry if there were a second referendum. I saw someone recently who said that after the Battle of Hastings in 1066, there should have been another fight in order to discover whether or not we were going to have a hard Norman conquest or a soft Norman conquest.
They did that in the north of England. It didn't go well.
No, the truth is that we had a long, passionate, at times wrenching referendum debate. In the end, the vote was clear, and overwhelmingly now, almost everyone who voted Leave and a significant section of people who voted Remain want the government to get on with it. And we have a Prime Minister who understands that, a government that are attuned to that. And while I respect John Major's huge history of service to this country, I think on this area, his reported comments are wrong.
All right, let's move on to something else. You mentioned Theresa May just now. She is worried, reportedly, about there being a cliff edge at the end of this process. We've had Mark Carney, the Governor of the Bank of England, now saying there should be a transition or a buffer period of maybe an extra 2 years or so that there is a smooth transition from being inside the EU to being outside the EU. A lot of business people will say that is a very sensible suggestion.
Well, I'm open to the case for a transitional agreement, but I'm not convinced that we need one, because, again, there is a tendency to overcomplicate this process. There are all sorts of things that we can do with our European partners in the future, and we should carry on doing. We should carry on cooperating with them in defence and security. We should carry on cooperating with them on environmental and terrorism areas. But outside the European Union, and these are ongoing processes, ongoing conversations that we have as a good neighbour. But my worry is that there are some people who can't get over the fact that the British people have voted to leave the European Union and want us to have a transitional arrangement which is as close as possible
as a way of avoiding Brexit, in essence.
Exactly. And some of these phrases, people talk about hard Brexit. What they're really trying to do is to make a liberation sound like a punishment. I think it's far, far better to provide people with certainty and to do so by having a clear, clean and simple approach which allows us to enter a new phase, Britain as a sovereign nation outside the EU, cooperating with our friends and neighbours.
Mr Verhofstadt, who greeted David Davis with welcome to hell when he arrived in Brussels recently, has said since then that he thinks that individual British people ought to have the ability to buy individual membership of the EU. So you could have two passports. You could be British, but also an EU citizen. Do you think that's a good idea?
I don't think it's a good idea, but the thing about Guy Verhofstadt is that he is a witty man, and I think that this was
a joke.
Well, I think it was a tease, a provocation. And I think the interesting thing is that to be fair to the EU's negotiating team, they've been broadly clear that they want to hang tough at this stage, and that's why I think Theresa May.
Tough.
Yeah, and that's why I think Theresa May is absolutely right to keep her cards close to her chest. The people who want more detail about her negotiating stance are the opposition, because they want to try and trip her up, and the media, because as a born-again journalist myself, we always want the next chapter in the story.
Of course.
But having been a minister a while back, I recognise that Theresa is playing it right.
Talking about hanging tough, what about the suggestion from Mr Schäuble, and indeed Mr Barnier as well, that we will be paying into the EU budget possibly until 2030 in terms of our commitments to people's pensions and so forth for a very long time?
Well, that's part of the...
Would that be acceptable?
Well, part of the Article 50 negotiation is to work out what the divorce arrangements are. I can see us, once we've left, still paying into common EU funds on things like science, but I think that, again, Minister Schäuble and Michel Barnier seem to me to be trying it on, rather. It's also interesting, though, that there are a range of voices in Germany. The Bavarian economics minister was saying just this weekend that it is absolutely vital, more vital for Germany than for Britain, that we have a free trade deal. So I think at this stage, there's a lot of shadow boxing. Let's make sure that when we get down to the proper negotiations, we do so with, and I think that the government are clear about this, a clear end date, at the end of which we're outside the European Union, and while we may be paying some legacy sums, they're tiny.
OK. Now, you were very clear, again, during the referendum campaign, that we were going to go into a new world of free trade deals around the world. Since then, we've had Donald Trump, who is a protectionist, anti-free trade deals, being elected in America. I was talking to Marine Le Pen, who is a protectionist in France. We'll see what happens there. But aren't we heading out into a free trading world at just the wrong moment when there are protectionists all around us?
I would not have voted for Donald Trump, and one of the reasons I would not have voted for him, and there are a number, is his protectionist rhetoric. But to be fair, since he's become president, he and his team have made it clear that they want a free trade deal with the UK. And the Speaker of the House of Representatives, Paul Ryan, the second or third most important Republican in the United States, has said that he wants a rapid free trade deal with the United Kingdom. So I hope that we can secure that trade deal, not just with America, but with other like-minded nations. And also Theresa May has made it clear, she wants to be a leader for the argument for free trade globally. And I think that there is a role for a British Prime Minister leading an independent sovereign nation in making the case for bringing down the borders on trade, but respecting countries' borders when it comes to security.
It's clearly in our interests as a country to do the best possible trade deal we can with Donald Trump's America. In that regard, wouldn't it be crazy for us to turn aside and push Nigel Farage out of the picture? Here is somebody, whatever you think of him, he has an in with Donald Trump. Shouldn't we be using that rather than abusing him?
I certainly think we should not be abusing Nigel Farage, but I think that the current ambassador in the United States, Kim Darch, whom I worked with when he was in a different role in government, is a fantastic guy, great diplomat. We should have professionals doing that job, but certainly Nigel Farage, 4 million people voted for him at the last general election. He's someone who, even though I may disagree with him on some issues, should be respected and not abused.
All right, much more to talk about, but for now, thank you very much indeed. And a word about what's coming up an hour from now, when Andrew Neil will be here with the Sunday Politics. He'll be picking up on Stephen Dorrell's comments about NHS funding with Labour's Shadow Health Secretary, Jonathan Ashworth. He will also be debating that question of a second EU referendum we were talking about just now with Lord Ashdown and the former Tory Cabinet Minister, Owen Paterson. That's the Sunday Politics with Andrew Neil from 11 a.m. here on BBC One. And Emily Thornberry magically is back here, the magic of television, with Michael Gove. Michael, you were saying earlier on, you were talking about mistakes. George Osborne made a very interesting intervention this week when he was saying, you know, as a minister, the trouble is you get caught up with things you've said and you can't ever deny them again. So you get caught up never admitting to any kind of mistakes. All politicians are the same. You hate to say that was a mistake, and therefore we get a kind of degraded political discourse. Do you both agree with that?
Yes.
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 I mean, the thing is, it's easier for me. It's easier. I mean, to be fair to him, it's easier for me. I'm a backbencher now, and you know, I had 6 years as a minister, and I can look back and say, well, I'm proud of that, but I made a complete Horlicks of the other. Emily's on the front line as Shadow Foreign Secretary. She's got to observe collective responsibility. So if you were to tempt Emily into acknowledging that she might have made mistakes, that would be a story. Whereas if I acknowledge the mistakes I've made, that's old news.
What's the worst mistake that you have made that you haven't fessed up to yet?
Well, I don't know. There are so many. But I made one I did fess up to, which happened, I think, relatively early on when I was Education Secretary, was cancelling building schools for the future. And there it was not so much that it was wrong to try to save public money. It was done in a crass and insensitive way. And it taught me a lesson. But I remember David Davis came up to me at the end of what had been a very bruising experience for me in the House of Commons. And he said, well, you, and he used an Anglo-Saxon phrase there.
Up.
Indeed.
You up.
But you will be a better minister for this because you learn from your mistakes. And one of the things, and I think this is perhaps one of the points of George's, is that there can sometimes be a football manager culture in politics, which mean that we are too quick to condemn people when they make a mistake and too quick to call for their resignation, when the best, and I think that's true of most politicians, learn from their errors and improve on the job.
Emily Thornberry, what do you think your worst mistake was? Was it the St George's Cross moment, which must be a scar on your back even now, I suspect?
I think what I regret about that is that people have taken it that I was sneering at people. And those who know my background, know that I was brought up on a council estate and know that my brother used to work as a builder, know that I don't sneer at people and that that's not fair. So I think that the fact that that was put out and that people were able to deliberately misinterpret it. I mean, some people were genuinely offended, but I think there was a lot of kind of spinning of it.
Did I detect from our earlier conversation that you did think that Jeremy Corbyn was a little bit unbalanced in his reaction to Castro?
I think that Jeremy tried to put forward both sides, and I think that it does depend which bit you're quoted on, doesn't it?
That is always the case, I guess, with all politicians.
Yes, it is. I mean, I disagree with Jeremy Corbyn about Fidel Castro, but that's not news either. I think that, you know, to be fair to all politicians, sometimes when we're trying to explain our position, we're not perfect. I mentioned earlier the thing I'd said about experts and the fact that actually I was making a broader point, and then in the heat of the debate I was
It wasn't
cut
totally
off.
adroit, perhaps, we would agree.
Two things, I'd say. One, the subsequent quotation was, I think, what could one say, unfair editing. But the other thing was, I wasn't particularly adroit in that interview either. You're absolutely right. And that's
I think
all
the trouble is that
We've
people...
also run out of time, I'm afraid. I'm terribly sorry. That also happens in politics, but for now, thank you both very much indeed.